Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. And what I have for you is this little surprise PC. Well, it's not that little actually. It's kind of a big MIDI tower type of form factor. It doesn't have any visible markings here. We have a 5¼ inch floppy drive, 3½ inch. We have LED display, turbo reset button. So yeah, a case that looks pretty old, but a bit difficult to guess what kind of PC we will be finding in this thing. It does have a really satisfying power button. Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. We have a nice little LED display here with turbo and reset button, as well as a key lock. So yeah, let's look at the rear of this thing to see if this will give us an additional clue. Daycom, which is, I think, the manufacturer of the PC here in Belgium. We have some basic ports here. I don't see a VGA connector, so that's a bit strange. So yeah, this one is from Hoboken, which is in Antwerp here in Belgium. We have the big power supply. We have some ports here and what appears to be a 9-pin D-sub connector. So, that will probably tell you something about the overall age of this PC, so it's definitely pre-VGA. So we also appear to have a big power supply here with the fan and the power input, power output. We have a sticker here from the computer manufacturer, which is called Daycom. Was located in Hoboken, Antwerp, Belgium. So yeah, pretty big power supply. Moving down, we can see a serial port here, an old style serial port, 25 pins, not the 9-pin serial connector we know for hooking up a mouse or something. We have a DIN style keyboard connector, parallel port, a game port, another parallel port, and a 9-pin D-sub connector. So that makes me think this is going to be an MDA or Hercules based machine. We have the 2 feet here on the bottom of the case. And when we go to the front, we have the really nice power button, reset, turbo, LED display. Now what's interesting is that there is a decimal separator here between the two single digits here. So that might already give you a clue. We have a power LED here, hard drive LED. And this seems to indicate the key lock position. We have the turbo button, a reset button, key lock, a really nice power switch, and the manufacturer logo here, Daycom. Moving to the drive bays. So on top here we have what appears to be an empty panel. We have a 5¼ inch floppy drive and a 3½ inch disk drive. On the bottom of the case we have this little grill here and the little feet that provide some stability to the case. So let's open her up and see what we have inside, because I'm very anxious to see what kind of PC we will be finding in this case. So let's do the big reveal. Ta-da! And you can probably already guess it, given the location of the RAM chips on the right bottom and the absence of 16-bit ISA slots. I'm guessing this is going to be an XT class computer. We have the big power supply. We have a couple of expansion cards here. So we have a video card. This seems to be some kind of controller card. And we've got a drive bay here on top. We have the floppy drives at the bottom. Here we have the PC speaker. Card on the bottom here appears to be an MFM controller card, judging by the two, ribbon cables that come out of it, which is probably hooked up to an MFM hard drive. The small card here is going to be the video card, and the one above that will be the floppy drive controller card. I already see a dreadful Varta battery here, so luckily it's only on this card and not on the actual motherboard. So I see a couple of dip switches on the board. I only see 8-bit ISA slots, so a couple of RAM chips here on the right. So yeah, definitely XT class machine. So let's look at the drive. So on top, we have the MFM hard drive, and judging by the 2 ribbon cables, which is in a 5¼ inch housing, but I think it's a 3½ inch MFM hard drive. So we'll take a look at that. And below that, we have the 5¼ inch floppy drive, and below that, the 3½ inch floppy drive. But let's start by taking a look at the actual expansion cards. And we'll start with this bottom one, which is the MFM hard drive controller. LCS, so we'll need to check that later on. Next up, we have the video card. This appears to be an MDA Hercules compatible video card, like you see a lot in these XT machines. And finally, here on the top, we have the floppy drive controller card with the Varta battery. That has definitely leaked onto the crystal beside it, so yeah. Just gonna see if this one still works. Now, because we have this front panel on the case, there is going to be a lot of these little jumper wires going into the motherboard for the reset, the turbo, the PC speaker. So we're going to go ahead and remove all of those, carefully documenting it so that we can put everything back into the correct place. Next up, we're going to be removing the power connectors, the ribbon cables for the floppy drives, hard drive, and getting the motherboard out of the case so that we can get a closer look. But first, I'm also going to be removing the floppy drives and the hard drive. So these are all sitting in their respective bays. So these come out relatively easily. The hard drive I had to pull down because I couldn't get that front panel off for some reason, so I had to gently slide it down, but there was this cable here which was connected to the hard drive and which was used for the hard drive LED activity. So after removing that and then carefully prying out the hard drive, I was able to get it out in one piece. And as expected, a 3½ inch MFM hard drive, the Seagate ST125. Now, first thing I wanted to try was the power supply. So I hooked up my multimeter and a hard drive to put some load on it. I noticed that the fan was spinning, so that was good. And I was able to hear the hard drive spinning, so it got power, and both the 5V and the 12V rails were okay. So far, so good. At least the power supply is working. But now, being the cautious person that I am, I did want to check if there weren't any shorts here on the motherboard. And for that, I'm just going to be using this power connector here. So there are 4 ground pins at the center of this connector. So these will all give continuity. I'm just going to check if there are no shorts with any of the other rails, like the 12V or the -12V. And there weren't any. So, logical thing to do is to just flip the switch and see if it will turn on. And oh boy, it did. I mean, there was this capacitor here close to the power supply connector which caught fire. So let's look at that again in slow motion. Yep, I would say that that one definitely popped. And here you can see the little tantalum capacitor that got top of its head blown off. Yep, that's definitely not good, but not that uncommon for these old XT computers. These tantalum capacitors are very error prone. So let's take a look at the power connector to see which one was damaged. So I've outlined the different voltage rails here on this little piece of paper. There are 4 ground connectors at the center, and on the left of those you have the 3 plus 5 volts and the minus 5 volt. And when these capacitors fails, it's usually the minus 12 volts and the 12 volts. So let's check those in relation to ground. So I'm just going to hook up a ground pin And let's check the minus 12 volt first, and we already have a short. And then the plus 12 volts, we also have a short. So notice that these shorts weren't there before the capacitor exploded, but now we are pretty sure that these two capacitors need to be replaced. This one definitely, because it got burned up, and we need to identify where the other one is. But let's first start with this one. So removing that one is pretty simple. Just heating up the pads and pulling the capacitor out. The only thing that we need to take into account, obviously, is that we need to free up these two through holes here, and we can either use this kind of desoldering wick or braid to clear the pins, or a desoldering pump, just to make sure that there isn't any solder residue in these holes. So now that we have one bad capacitor removed, let's go ahead and see which one it is. So as you can see, there is a plus symbol here, which is the positive voltage. So let's see where it is hooked up. So yeah, this is definitely the plus 12 volt capacitor, but we still need to look for the minus 12 volt one, and it's going to be one of these three. So now that we have one bad capacitor removed, it will be pretty straightforward to find the other culprit. It's going to be one of these three. So let's just go ahead, which one is shorted. Not this one, not this one, but it's apparently this one. So this one will need to be removed as well. And that's going to be this little guy here. And again, after removing the capacitor, just make sure that the through holes are cleared so that it will become a lot easier to put the new capacitors in. But first, let's take a look at how we measure this capacitor here, because this is the minus 12 volt one. And as you can see, it also has a plus symbol, but when we look at the negative side of this capacitor, you will see that it will not provide continuity with ground, but instead it will provide continuity with the actual rail. And that's because this is a negative voltage. So when I go to the plus sign of this capacitor, it will actually provide continuity with the ground rail. And that's the thing with these negative voltages. You need to turn things around in terms of measurements, but in terms of placement, you need to take into account the plus symbol of the capacitor. And don't make the mistake of putting it in the other way around. And here we have our little culprits. 10 microfarad 25 volt capacitors. Now I have some replacement capacitors here. These are rated 35 volts, but that's perfectly fine. As long as they have the same capacitance, which is 10 microfarad, we should be good. So I'm just going to be replacing the two bad capacitors with new ones. Now I will also be replacing the 5 volt capacitors, but in terms of placing these new replacement capacitors, we need to take into account the plus sign of the capacitor and always make sure that the capacitor is oriented in the correct way. And it doesn't matter if this is a plus 12 volt or minus 12 volt, it's the plus sign which is on the PCB that should correspond to the plus sign which is on the capacitor. So we're just going to pop these two boys right in. Apply some solder, remove the excess legs, and try to see if it will boot now. So flip the switch, and as we are focusing on the monitor, we see the amber color slowly lighting up. The computer is booting, but what's going on there with the video card? That doesn't seem normal. So a big puff of smoke coming out of the video card, and again a capacitor which has seen the end of its life. In this case, it's this little blue one here with the black marking. I think this is also a 10 microfarad capacitor. So yeah, I'm gonna see if I have a replacement for that. Now, luckily, I do have a spare MDA video card that will fit the system nicely. It is pretty similar as most of these, cheap MDA Hercules video cards are. I think this one even does CGA because it has a color jumper. We'll focus more on that in part 2 of this video. But this should be good for now to get the machine to boot without any explosions or without any smoke. So let's go ahead and try it. I'm just going to flip the switch, see if the machine will boot without any explosions. And we're going to leave it at that for this part 1 of the video. So we get the memory count, 640K. We get the Phoenix ROM BIOS. So yeah, XT class machine with a Phoenix ROM BIOS, 640K of memory, and so far so good. So everything seems to run. We will obviously be getting a disk boot failure here because nothing is attached to the computer, but that's what we're going to be looking at in part 2. What is the condition of the floppy controller? What is the condition of the 2 floppy drives? Does the hard drive still work? We'll go over some of the components in this machine, and then we'll try and figure out what to do with this machine, because I find this form factor to be rather unique for an XT class machine. So yeah, lots of stuff to look forward to in part 2. I hope you guys stick around. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing, consider giving this a thumbs up, leave something in the comments, and I hope to see you guys very, very soon. Bye bye, take care.